This is Chris O'Brien, and this is an introductory video to Fundamentals of Paraphrasing and Summarizing, developed by researchers at the University of Kansas Center for Research on Learning and part of the Strategic Instruction Model. Again, this is Part 1, the introduction. This professional learning opportunity was developed through funding provided by the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs for the NC State Professional Development Grant North Carolina State Improvement Project. This grant was awarded to the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction's Exceptional Children Division's Program Improvement and Professional Development section. For more information on the North Carolina State Improvement Project, please visit www.ncsip.org. Please note, if you're beginning to work with Fundamentals of Paraphrasing and Summarizing, that there are two separate resources that look quite similar to each other. One is an instructor's manual, and one is the accompanying student materials resource. So as we begin to think about Fundamentals of Paraphrasing and Summarizing, take a moment to stop, pause the video, reflect and think about your struggling readers. What is it like day to day to be a struggling reader in one of your classes? What do you think their processes are like? What do they struggle with, actually, when it comes to reading? Hopefully you had a chance to pause the video and think about that for a second. When I think about struggling readers, I think about my time teaching middle school. One year, teaching 7th grade, I was teaching literacy intervention classes and also inclusion sections of English language arts. And I had a particularly strong group of readers, even though my students had been identified as being struggling readers throughout their time in elementary school. I had one young man who was so incredibly strong in his decoding and fluency that he would volunteer to read at all times. One day I asked him if he could tell me to kind of summarize in his own words what he had just been reading. And he said, "What do you mean, summarize?" And I said, "Tell me about what you were just reading. What was it all about?" And he said, "Oh, I read it, but I wasn't listening." And this was a huge moment for me as a teacher of reading to realize that many of my students, even those who could read fluently and decode text, still had far to go in thinking about how to be a strong reader. Many of you may be familiar with the work of Janet Allen, and she says it best when she summarizes the challenge of many of these readers as being passive. She says, "It is this very passivity, at least in terms of academics, that I have found often characterizes students in special programs or resource classes. They wait for work. They wait for something to happen. They wait to get out of school. As passive non-readers, they wait for reading to happen to them, not knowing that reading doesn't work that way." So the question becomes, how do we help these students go from being passive to being active, truly engaged in the reading experience? I want to take a moment to think about some things that really work in the work that we do in teaching reading. The Institute of Education Sciences looked at practical recommendations for teachers in the upper grades working with adolescents, trying to figure out what would really help struggling readers to overcome the difficulties they're experiencing. Here's what they found. They said that schools should provide explicit vocabulary instruction, direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction, and some others for you to consider here. But I want you to think very carefully about this idea of direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction. What would that look like? How would that support students? And that's where we're going with this video. Students need strategies. So in that last recommendation you heard that it said schools should support students with direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction. But when I say strategies, I mean strategies that the student has in place for themselves. When they confront text, how do they approach it? How do they master it? Ultimately, the best strategies can help students to really boost their performance. And many times when you hear students speak of strategies, they think of sports. They think of having a game plan, how they're going to approach something challenging. And that's what we're talking about right now. The strategic instruction model has for some time had many different strategies for approaching reading tasks. One of the most established strategies is called the paraphrasing strategy. Now, take a step back here for a second. I realize this video is Fundamentals of Paraphrasing and Summarizing, but I just want to have a moment to recognize the differences between these two things. The paraphrasing strategy has been shown to be highly effective. I mean, look at this data. Students with reading level materials went from 51% correct on comprehension questions to 80%, with grade level materials from 48% to 84%. Highly effective strategy for supporting students. If I were to take a step back to our previous slide that I asked you to finish reading by yourself, we talk about extended discussion, motivation and engagement has to be key. But we also talk about intensive and individualized interventions for struggling readers. And I want to be very clear. This data was obtained by providing intensive and individualized intervention. So what is the paraphrasing strategy exactly? Why would we teach it? Paraphrasing strategy is highly effective in terms of helping to promote students become active in their reading. It is a during reading strategy. And when I say during reading, I don't mean the kind of during reading strategies where the teacher asks the student to stop in the middle of reading in front of the class. This is something where it makes the student active in the reading process for themselves. When they are independently reading, how do they monitor their own comprehension? Can they actually engage actively in their thought processes while reading? Now, what we do in the paraphrasing strategy is we ask students to search out and state main ideas and details for paragraphs. Why would we focus on main ideas? Well, main ideas are what the paragraph is mostly about. You may have been familiar with this mnemonic device. It's been seen all over the country in English classrooms and literacy classrooms for a generation. The paraphrasing strategy steps are the mnemonic device RAP. Read the paragraph. Another way you could say that is read and chunk the paragraph. Read one paragraph at a time so that it's manageable. Ask what are the main ideas and details from that paragraph, and put the main idea and details, at least two, into your own words. Now, step 2, when it says ask what are the main ideas and details, I often instructed my students to try and think about this while they were reading. Try it yourself. It's quite challenging to read and be evaluating your understanding and comprehension and ability to summarize text all at the same time. Most of us who are good at it have just done it for so long that it's become habitual or automatic. So what makes this strategy so powerful? The rationale behind the paraphrasing steps are associated with, first, chunking material into a manageable unit so that it can be easily understood, managed, and easier for memory. Second, the strategy requires students to actively interact with the text. Much like Janet Allen was speaking about before, we're moving away from passivity and promoting a way for students to actively interact with and think about the text. Third, the RAP mnemonic gives students a step-by-step process that requires a high level of attention during reading. This during reading cognitive linguistic engagement is a step up from the passive way that students often are decoding and fluently reading text but not really thinking. What are they thinking about? They should be thinking about the main idea, and the questions they should be asking them are simple. What is this paragraph about? What does it tell me? Simple and yet not so simple, and so essential. If a student can read a paragraph or a passage and they can't tell you what it's all about, if they can't summarize it in their own words, it's questionable whether or not that has been meaningful reading. But what if they need more? What if your students aren't quite ready for a strategy like paraphrasing? For example, what if they don't have their own words? Now, I'm being a bit facetious here, but this is something that teachers often report, that students trying to paraphrase things in their own words don't always have enough mastery of the English language to do so. Perhaps they just have a very limited vocabulary and struggle with this concept. Next, what if they just don't understand the main idea and need more practice? These kind of concepts are elusive to them, new to them, and something that just needs more scaffolding. What if instruction is large group rather than small group intervention? I think we can all relate to this being a concern. When I was teaching middle school, I had both large group and small group, which I personally think is ideal. I could provide intensive individualized interventions in small groups of 10 or less, but I also had the opportunity to bring these kinds of strategies into whole group instruction. Well, We have some tools to help us. Finally, I get to the idea of fundamentals of paraphrasing and summarizing being the next steps here. We have two different resources, as I mentioned before, the instructor manual and the student manual. So when we look back to this curriculum of learning strategies associated with acquiring information, or essentially mostly reading, we look at paraphrasing and realize that there's quite a bit of a need for a scaffold, for a way to try and help students step into the paraphrasing strategy. And the fundamentals of paraphrasing and summarizing serves that purpose. Let's take a look for a second. What if they don't have their own words? Well, the curriculum addresses this by having students go back to the level of words, phrases, and sentences, and with a high level of support from their teacher, students have the opportunity to do very simple to more complex paraphrasing opportunities. Try this with your students. You'll be shocked at how challenging this can often be. There's a process of watching, sharing, and practicing, quintessential I do, we do, you do. What if they just don't understand the main idea and need more practice? The fundamentals approach supports this as well by giving opportunities for students to see paragraphs established with already given topics and main ideas. This is just one small example of many of the kinds of resources available in this particular approach, but it gives you an idea of how students have more support. It also should give you an idea of how this might be a little bit easier to do with a whole group. Now, let's look at these materials. Well,